Good morning, everyone. This is Parker, and today we are going to be discussing what Paul meant by his use of the word slaves as he used it in Romans 6, verse 16, where he says, "Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are a slave to the one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness?" Now, as we approach this passage, especially from our American context, we need to understand that there is a different meaning of slavery here. We as Americans approach it with the prior knowledge that we have of American slavery, but we need to understand that that is not the type of slavery that Paul is in reference to here. He is not saying that we need to offer ourselves as slaves to God and slaves to righteousness in the means of having no rights and having no say in it, but we are going to learn what he actually means when he says this. The first thing we need to understand is that slavery was a very common practice in the Greco-Roman world during the time of which this was written. Jeffers states that the Romans at first killed their enemy soldiers who surrendered to them, but at some point they began enslaving their enemies instead. And then he goes on to say any free person, Roman, Greek, or Near Eastern, had the legal right to own a slave, and virtually no one questioned the justness of slavery. That was found on page 220 of Jeffers' reading. So as we see there, slavery was a very common practice in the context of which Paul was writing to the Roman church. They would have understood that slavery was something that took place in their culture virtually every day and virtually with any free person that chose to do so. But they would also know that though slavery was common, it was still not as we viewed it. As we look into the Zondervan Pictorial Encyclopedia of the Bible, Volume 5 by Tenney, we will see as he outlines what slavery looked like in the New Testament, we can get a better vision of what that would have been like. He says on page 459, while an individual was a slave, he was in most respects equal to a freeborn counterpart in the Greco-Roman world, and in some respects he had an advantage. By the 1st century AD, the slave had most of the legal rights which was granted to a free man. Many had a considerable amount of money at their disposal and had a right to wife and family. He goes on to say that the slave was not inferior to the free man of similar skills in regard to food and clothing, and that most slaves at Rome were as well dressed as free men in an unusual way. He goes on to say, it's presumed that the slave also ate well, or as well as the poor free man, and the masters provided for them in many other ways, such as housing and allowing them to have wives and children. The free laborer in the New Testament was seldom in better circumstances than their slave counterpart, and the average free laborer at Rome in the provinces could expect to earn about 1 denarius per day, which was the pay of the workers in the vineyard in Jesus's parable. So as we can see, slave life was not worse than a free man's life, and that they actually would feel comfortable in this form of slavery because they would have been financially comfortable, not having to worry about finding work as they would already know that they had it. Which brings us back to how slavery was practiced among the Israelites. If you flip a couple pages back in Tenney's reading, on page 455, he says that self-sale slavery was actually a very common practice among the Israelites. In the law of Exodus and the law of Deuteronomy, a man could sell himself into slavery voluntarily because he would enjoy this economic security and security of having a home and not having to worry about that. So as we can see, these are all things that the context in which Paul was writing to the Romans, they would have understood, they would have known these things. And we know that because of what Moo says in his reading. On page 210, he says, Paul usually uses the introductory phrase, "don't you know," as he used in verse 16 to cite a fact that his readers would have already known. So from that statement, we can know that the readers would have already known all the context that we just covered throughout this lesson. He goes on to say, in this case, they would recognize what Paul was saying as a proverbial truth. When we habitually offer ourselves to someone, we become a slave to that which we offer ourselves. Sin, then, is a serious matter. Though set free from it, we can in effect become a slave again if we give ourselves as an offering to it. So that's how we need to approach this passage and understand what slavery meant. Slavery would have been us offering ourselves into living that kind of life. It would have not been against our will, but actually our choice to offer ourselves in that way. So he's saying it is a matter of who you offer yourselves to, of what your life will look like. So then we are posed with the choice, am I going to offer myself freely, habitually to sin and continue going on sinning despite God's grace and mercy, or am I going to offer myself as an obedient slave to righteousness so that I can have eternal life? So think about that as you go throughout your week. What do you want to offer yourselves to in terms of slavery to death or slavery to righteousness?